Super excited to be able to share this latest video on my YouTube channel, where we really focus on the nature of autoimmune disease. This is the talk that I gave to the Irish ME Trust, and we had, I think, maybe 100 plus people on the talk. The Q&A session was really rich. We can't share the Q&A due to data protection, but I shared my ideas, my research, my studies, and my own path to recovery in terms of my own mental health, but also the autoimmune diseases that I suffer from, and how recovering from those led me to understand the vagus nerve, the autonomic nervous system, and the neuroscience behind our well-being. And this is a rich conversation where I share some of the beauty of the simple things that I've understood and learned and developed in my own life with you guys. So please, if you know somebody who's struggling with autoimmune disease, share the video. If it's you, I hope you find something from it. Leave comments below. I pick up and answer all of my comments and questions. Check out the talk. A little bit about me. Previously, I've been an entrepreneur, quite a successful one. I worked in financial services in London from the time I was 19. So I grew up in Ireland, went to school in Northside Dublin. I was dyslexic. I grew up in a house where my father was very ill, so he had electric shock treatment, chronic anxiety, depression. He was suicidal and hospitalized for much of my teenage life. So I kind of flew the nest at the first available opportunity at 19 and went to London after dropping out of college. So I was quite a dysfunctional teenager, dyslexic, and that was back in the days when you were just regarded as stupid. We didn't really go into too much detail as to why you couldn't necessarily understand what you could see and read or understand how you could write. I only discovered dyslexia in my 20s. But I worked in banking at a very young age, a very successful career for the first 4 years. I then left at 23 and built an organization where we employed 250 people. We were covering everything from complex investments to advising banks on their own strategy. So I was a highly functioning, highly capable, very driven individual who constantly really felt that the pathway to success and happiness was continuing to increase one's material gain, work harder, don't give up, and keep pushing. And that was definitely without any understanding or awareness of how that might be impacting my mental health or my physical health. And in time and in years later, I would understand that I was actually a workaholic. So I didn't really have any time for very much anything else except work. And I always kept thinking that if I can just do this next deal, build this next company, close this next transaction, then I'll put my hand on that trophy, and then finally, then I'll be happy. But of course, every time you try and put your hand on whatever it is that you're seeking or pursuing or striving for, there's an inevitable emptiness there afterwards. And then you go back to the well and think about, what is it that I want? So life really continued to work along those lines. And then I got married. I had my first child. Then we were trying for a second child, and we struggled. We had 3 miscarriages, which were really challenging emotionally for myself and my wife. And then got pregnant on our second child, and we ended up on a holiday in Spain when she was pregnant on our second child. And during that holiday, she woke me up at 3 o'clock in the morning to tell me her waters had broken. And we were 150 miles from the nearest city. So what started at that moment lasted for 11 months. We never got to leave Spain. So our second child, Joshua, was born at 26 weeks. He was given no hope of survival at birth because of the nature of his birth, the time in terms of his developmental needs. and the stress around his birth as well. So he was born, he was in neonatal intensive care for 6 months. We had to find a way to live in Spain. We had another 4-year-old with us at the time, and our life stopped completely. So we became incredibly mindful, as I'm sure most people here can recognize, that when you have to deal with a very acute issue, when you have to really focus on something, you can bring this immense capacity to be completely present to what's within your life. And it's certainly something that I'd never really been in any way, shape or form exposed to before. So Joshua spent 6 months in neonatal intensive care. He was too ill to be air ambulanced back to the UK, where we were living at that stage. And we had to try and figure out where we're going to live, what we're going to do, and how we're going to take care of this child who had huge developmental needs. After 6.5 months, they started to teach and train us as his carers, because he was tube fed, he was oxygen dependent, he needed his airways vacuumed out and cleaned all the time. So we trained us as carers, and then they allowed him to be at home with us if we could rent a house within 2 kilometers of the hospital, which we did. And then we had physicians attending every day to help us at home as a family. And things were starting to improve. We were also had him in rehab. So lots of positive things were happening. But Joshua kept getting ill. You know, his lungs just were not giving him enough strength. And we eventually got to the point where we thought we were going to get him home. But once more, which happened many times, we weren't able to sustain him at home. And we were then having to bring him back into hospital again for the 4th time that they intubated him and put him on life support. And at that time, they just said to us, look, you know, we know the fight that you guys have put up, but, you know, this boy is not for this world. And probably deep down inside, of course, we knew that. But as parents, you fight wherever you can. So just coming up to a year after that first moment in Spain, we lost Joshua, and he died very peacefully, very happily with us at home. And we have great, fantastic memories of it, because once the decision was made that there was no more medical interventions, we were able to bring him home, remove all of the medications, all of the therapies, everything else. And we had 3 wonderful weeks together as a family, which we'll cherish for the rest of our lives. And that really changed my life, surprisingly enough. I'm sure that's shocking to hear. But the constant striving, pushing and fighting approach should have at that point brought me to realize, well, you know, there's more to life than the next deal, and grief was something that I needed to embrace. But I didn't. So my wife did. She spent the next 6 to 8 months walking with a dog in the mountains. We moved back to Ireland for some family and support. She spent the next 6 to 8 months walking in the mountains in Ireland, grieving, being in nature, slowing down. I didn't. Within 2 months of Joshua's death, I was already setting up a new company. Within 3 months of his death, I had recruited new board directors and shareholders. And within 6 months of his death, I was spending at least I was on at least 4 flights a week and flying all over the world. So I was the masculine approach to grief, you know, I can push on and get through this. And I would actually advocate and show people that I thought this was a really positive way to behave. And it isn't, needless to say. So I eventually had a panic attack and my physical and mental health deteriorated and fell apart. So there's tragedy in there, but there's also a lot of hope and positivity. Joshua changed my life. He made me a better dad, a better husband. He connected me to my wife and my son, my other son, who's now 14. And I ultimately think he saved my life, because I don't think I would have survived the way that I was living without him coming along to give me a kick in the pants. So he is my spiritual and life guru who gave me a big lesson. And then eventually my body came along and kicked me in the pants too. So what I want to talk about is what I've learned since the panic attack, how I discovered the capacity to find wellness from a physical and mental perspective, and the ways that I do that. As Declan said at the start, one of the things that I've become quite known for is my research and work into the vagus nerve, and really in terms of mental and physical health and how we can recover from them. So the presentation today, which I'll just share my screen. Anybody who wants to go into a lot deeper detail, there's resources on my website and my YouTube channel. After I was unwell, I trained as a therapist, and I turned up at my boardroom one day and called my shareholders to a meeting and told everybody I was selling my shares, resigning as CEO of an investment firm that had thousands of clients, because I was going to become a therapist and focus on neuroscience and recovery. They all thought I'd lost the plot, but I didn't. Thankfully, I changed all that, and here I am. So, what was going wrong? So after I had my panic attack, the panic attack was in 2015. My body was already starting to go wrong in 2014. I was really starting to have thoughts racing, tension in my face, and my body was having sinusitis. I was having lots of other issues going on. But in 2015, I went to see my doctor with anxiety, and he told me, you need to go on medication. Then I discovered I had post-traumatic stress disorder. I was told, you need to go on medication. Excuse me. Then I was told I had IBS. Well, I knew I had IBS, but when diagnosed, medication, sinusitis, more medication, leaky gut, more medication, and acid reflux, more medication. So at the end of this whole process, I was pumping my body with medication all the time. And as I've learned and studied in terms of mindfulness-based interventions in UCD and the neuroscience of stress, we're already hitting our body hard, but the medications can make things worse. And this presentation is not about not taking your medication. It's just about what happens when we don't really join the dots in terms of our overall health. So I wasn't getting any solutions, and I was getting more and more unwell. So my body was really starting to fall apart. So in 2012, I had chronic allergies and sinus issues. So that was a year after Joshua's death. My body just started to go wrong. Couldn't figure out why. Couldn't be anything to do with unresolved grief. This was just a physical thing. Then in 2012, I started to develop chronic pain and headaches. But again, I would ignore them because I was trying to medicate around them. I was trying to push through. And alcohol was definitely helping me in the evening times to manage that. 2013, I started to develop joint and muscle pains. I was getting injuries very easily. Chronic pains in my feet, in my knees. 2013, infections, urinary infections, and then my sex drive literally stopped. No interest in sex, no interest in anything really to do with myself. I was really starting to lose that sense of self. Then I developed asthma, never had it in my entire life. Went to see one of the many specialists along the way. So I'm now under the care of a pulmonary specialist in Vincent's in 2013 who is medicating me. Steroids, inhalers, multiple studies of my lungs. No idea what it was all related to. At no point do any of the doctors who were looking at all of these things ever ask me about grief. Liver damage and alcohol. So I started to have markers in my blood for liver damage because I was medicating myself with alcohol just to try and calm the noise and the chaos in my head. IBS and leaky gut. So my stomach was absolutely in all kinds of difficulty. And then I had leaky gut. Again, I went to see one of the best gastroenterologists in Ireland. At this stage, I just started to understand meditation and mindfulness. And my therapist at the time, who became my teacher, suggested to me that I should try and stay awake during the examination of my gut to see what's actually going on. So gastroenterologist was quite perturbed that somebody wanted to not be anesthetized, because when they push the camera through you, it's about that wide, and down it went. But my therapist, who was all about holistic living at this point, said to me, get to see what's going on in your stomach, see the damage, so we can discuss it. And if anybody's ever seen what leaky gut looks like, what actually happens is the membrane in your stomach, its capacity to open and close, it's almost like a muscle as it moves. Peristalsis is that movement of food and digestion through the body. It kind of just gives in, and it's not got that flexibility, and that starts to create a situation where the muscle tissue is weak and it opens up, and it looks like a wind turbine pushing stuff through. So the gastroenterologist was like, firstly amazed that I'm still awake while he's shoving the camera down, and then he's going, look, there it is. I don't know why you even want to see this, because there's nothing you can do here. And he said to me, you're going to be on medication for the rest of your life. And he said, if it's a Friday night and you're having a nice bottle of Barolo, he said, just have 2 tablets. He said, whenever you're going to have a few drinks, just take a few more tablets, and that will help with your leaky gut. But you can't fix this. It's irreversible. 2014 and 2015, I was into cardiologists in the Beacon Hospital. So I had chest pains, presented with all of the symptoms of heart attack, etc. And again, nobody was really paying any attention to the death of my son, and maybe I hadn't resolved that. And then 2016, I discovered something called neuroscience. The understanding of how the nervous system interacts with all of the body, the mind, the body, the nervous system, and actually how we can regulate ourselves. And I'd already been in therapy at this stage for a year, and I'd finished my therapy, and I'd asked my therapist to become my teacher. So with his work and his assistance, I moved from training as a therapist into a deeper understanding of neuroscience. Now, I've lived my life in highly complex markets, in hedge funds. I'm a certified investment fund director. I was advising UK government on complex regulatory policy. Despite being dyslexic, it also works very well in terms of your capacity to understand and discern complex information when you learn how to read properly, or learn how to read for your own capacity. So all of a sudden, I found something that was very complex, but actually it really related to me and my health. And then I discovered the vagus nerve. So within that, I realized that there is this vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10. So we have all these cranial nerves that carry out key functions, but cranial nerve 10 is really interesting. So vagus comes from the Latin of wandering, and the vagus nerve literally moves all the way through the body. So it's contacting all parts of your body. Most importantly, it's in contact with all of your key organs. It manages your respiratory system, your heart rate, your digestive system, liver and kidney functions, and also it manages your pain receptors. And it regulates stress. So at the key point, I was like, it regulates stress. And that kind of made me reflect, like, what was wrong with me at the start? I was stressed. And grief is stress. Loss is stress. Isolation from COVID is stress. Losing your job is stress. Death of a loved one is stress. The end of a relationship is stress. So all of a sudden, I started to notice that stress and loss are the same. And everybody seems to struggle with some form of loss or stress in their life. And then we have these 2 ways of the vagus nerve to be, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And to put it simply, sympathetic is the fight, flight, and freeze response. So it's like how the body should be when we're under pressure. And that worked really well for 200,000 years, because whenever we were faced with something that was likely to end our lives, we learned how to either feign dead, freeze, or how to flight, run, or worst case scenario, fight. And the nature of this is that it should be only on 5% of the time. It should only come on now, like if I was to suddenly jump at the screen and shout, everybody would be like, oh, what was that? And that's your stress response. And if you notice when you breathe, when you're stressed, if somebody jumps up, you go, we breathe in sharply, and we just breathe into our upper respiratory system. And now my nervous system knows I'm under threat. The opposite, the parasympathetic, is rest and digest, or rest and recovery. And that's how we should be all the time, paying attention, moving around the world, happy. When I'm in parasympathetic, rest and digest, my cognitive brain works. When I'm in the stressed way, I don't actually have my cognitive brain, because the way that stress works is, if we're under an impending threat to life, we don't need to kind of reflect on, the works of Shakespeare before we decide that we're going to run or fight. We need to just take action. So the physiology of the human being is very clever. In a stress state, it turns off your cortex. It turns off your capacity to do highly functioning tasks, and it just tells you either run, fight, or freeze. So we're in parasympathetic, we're very present, and we're able to think. And again, if this is stressed, parasympathetic is, if you breathe out and your diaphragm falls down, your shoulders are down, your body is parasympathetic. Anybody who's ever done breath work, yoga, meditation, we always say, take a deep breath in and then breathe out slowly. It's the slow exhale that connects to the rest and digest. So how I started to find balance, I kind of realized that all these medications were not necessarily helping. And I needed to become more balanced. So I needed to do the research. I started to understand lots about my mood and my well-being. I started to understand that nature was stimulating how I felt. If I went outside and lay down in the grass and looked at the sky, I felt better. Not like cured, but I definitely felt better than not being in nature. I discovered mindfulness. I eventually would go on to discover a very ancient form of Buddhism, which I now practice. So an element of spirituality definitely came into play. And I would say spirituality in the sense of that young person that I described to you, who was running around like a lunatic before my second son arrived, was filled with ego. One of the great things about spirituality was to realize the insignificance of my own life in terms of the world, and how if I could see the whole of the world and everybody around me, I could actually feel a bit better too. So PTSD brought me to a sense of rediscovery of myself, understanding my grief, understanding the connection to nature, finding mindfulness, understanding the research around neuroscience, understanding balance. Homeostasis is balance. It's this sense of, how do we get the human body and being to be in its natural state of balance? And all of that started to impact my mood. I started to feel better. So the steps to balance. 2014, I went into therapy and had my first introduction to the mind, body, and gut connection. 2015, I stopped drinking alcohol. I haven't drank any alcohol since then, because it's not very good in terms of managing our nervous system or our health. Focused on my allergies, and I realized that if I cleaned up my own health, my allergies just started to disappear. And I got into more movement. Like in 2014 and 2015, I was significantly overweight. I probably weigh about 81 kilos now. I was probably weighing 105 kilos, I think. At that stage. And alcohol and food were definitely maladaptive approaches for me. I would eat and drink when I was feeling unhappy. 2016, I focused on work. I started to realize that flying all the time and pushing myself to extremes wasn't actually doing me very good. And I'll explain how bad I got in a minute. I also discovered the benefits of cold water to connect to the vagus nerve, lifestyle changes that were needed to improve my vagal tone, which is the balance of how we get the vagus nerve working properly. A plant-based diet, where I just really started to focus on whole foods. And I'm not saying that everybody has to become plant-based, but definitely getting more fruit and veg in, because fiber into the gut is so important. The gut is the second brain in terms of what we understand of neuroscience in the last 25 years. And in 2017, I quit my board. I sold my shares. I enrolled in a master's program in UCD, developed a spiritual practice. I found my tribe as well. I realized that community and like-minded people is also a very important part of living. So managing the vagus nerve and the body. I said here, it's never too late to start the simple work to assist your body to better regulate the stress response. Remember, I quite nearly killed myself before I realized that I could change. And when I say quite literally, when things got to their worst in 2015, all of my physical body was failing. Everything, like literally every part of me was failing. And I was miserable, and I was incredibly depressed and extremely anxious. And I came to the point where the only exit I could see was suicide. And I started to plan my own suicide, and I thought this was the way forward. I had wealth and success, and we didn't have mortgages or debts. We had beautiful houses. We had all the things that everybody wants to try and find. But I was miserable, and I couldn't find or see a way to find any sense of ease or comfort in my life anymore. And I didn't understand what was going on. So little by little, over the course of 3 years, all of the component parts of my body were starting to fail. And it came to the point where that's the exit that I thought it was going to be. I thought my wife would find a better husband. I thought my son would find a better dad. But I had a good therapist who told me, let's just do the work. Let's just buckle down and do the work. And within my therapy, I was also learning to meditate. I was learning about mindfulness, and I was learning about the vagus nerve. So we had to start with a plan. It was slow and steady, but results in terms of meditation and mindfulness do start to appear within weeks. But it's not easy. So it's always hard, and it's always tough to be consistent. So an overview of the work that I needed to do: coaching and therapy, and mindfulness at the core, and still are to this day. Every day I meditate. That's the number one thing. And then it's exercise, time in nature, and diet. So I still have a very clean diet. I focus on what goes into my body. I often try and look at myself in terms of, imagine you could see like a little man riding on the back of my brain. He's almost like a jockey on the back of my brain with levers and buttons, and he's driving this machine. And then it's my job, if he's the spirit of this being, it's my job to make sure that whatever fuel we put in and whatever movement we give it can bring a more optimal outcome so that he can move and I improve. But you have to protect yourself 365 days a year. When people work with me or they come on my programs, I'll tell them it's not easy. This is not a part-time approach. But I also remember how miserable I felt. And I think in terms of some parts of the work that you can do to better regulate your nervous system can bring improvement. And even to the point, we know that the work undertaken just in terms of mindfulness and meditation for chronic pain is quite interesting in terms of being able to better live and manage chronic pain as well. So we've seen for the past 40 years, over 10,000 studies now to show that we can better manage chronic pain by developing a mindfulness meditation practice, which when this was first brought to the fore in the 1980s in the US, we didn't really understand why or how it was happening. But now through neuroscience, we can see that it's a way to actually help the nervous system go to the rest and digest state, the parasympathetic. So the vagus nerve impacts every part of your body. It regulates breathing, digestion, senses, survival. It regulates the fight and flight response. In 2001, Stephen Purges discovered polyvagal theory, which is huge in terms of our understanding about what we can do better with the neuroscience of the vagus nerve and polyvagal theory. So much so that we've been able to look at it, and it's starting to help kids with ADHD and even kids who present with autism. There is vagal tone work going on and clinical data to show how it can help kids with autism who may otherwise not be able to associate or be with other human beings, after a few months are starting to be able to find connection with their parents. And, you know, for 3,000 years, meditation and yoga has also focused on the vagus nerve in the East, except they called it the Kundalini coiled serpent. It's Kundalini yoga. And it's been in existence for a long time. My teacher who helped me recover from the death of Joshua is an Indian psychiatrist called Dr. Pradeep Chadha. And Dr. Chadha trained as a doctor and a psychiatrist, but the therapy that he gave and worked with me was all about mindfulness, meditation, and understanding the nervous system. So you have to pay attention to understand. You have to experience your life, you know, and one of the things that I think was so important for us to be able to say now is what happened to you? You know, we're always asking this question, you know, why are you like this? But what happened to you? You know, for me, the anxiety and stress came much earlier than Joshua's death. It started with a really troubled childhood. So I needed to do a lot of reflective work back there to find the entry point of my pain, because that was manifesting itself in all kinds of physical problems in my body. I needed to analyze it. And one of the great challenges of therapy and coaching or doing this type of work is I don't really want to go back and look at it all. But it's already here. We're trying to run away from so much and we can't. An analogy I often use is it's like the wedding car in the old movies when the tin cans are tied to the back as it pulls away and the tin cans are rattling behind it. That's all the stuff in the past that we don't want to deal with. And as we keep trying to run away from it, guess what that is? Flight. And guess what position your nervous system is in when you're trying to run away? If only I was over there, if only I had a different partner, a different house, a different job, if only I had this, then I'd be happy, keep moving away. I don't want to look back, don't want to have to deal with what's behind me. Flight, 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 nervous system, on. So in 2021, we now have people who are chronically stressed. The nervous system is always on. And it's like low-grade anxiety. It's like always pulsing there. And it only needs the slightest little thing, and then it's inflamed. Not how the human being is supposed to be. So the idea of doing the work is, what would it like to stop? What would it like to be to stop running, to sit down, reach behind, and start taking some of these tin cans out and getting close to them and understanding them. And that's what I had to do with Joshua and my parents. I had a lot of death and a lot of violence in my past, but I found a capacity to reach into myself and to come to terms with it, and ultimately to change the language. Like with PTSD after the death of a child, I couldn't say Joshua had died. I'd say he's gone somewhere else. He's off in heaven. He's with the angels. So the language that I was even speaking to myself was avoidance. So when I moved to understanding that everything that's in the past can no longer hurt me, and the more I can come to terms with it, the more I can live in the present. And that was a discerning point where I could change my outcomes. And that changed now. What does that mean? So in terms of how I manage the vagus nerve and the vagal response and the research that I do into it, I use intermittent fasting, nature, walking, Pilates, making sure I drink lots of water, being in cold water, being with my family, being in community, mindfulness, plant-based diet, and spirituality, you know. I'm not really that important, and finding a connection into something greater than me. So 3 reasons to regulate your vagus nerve. Pretty easy, as I discovered. The alternative for me was surgeries, doctors, and hospital time. And what was that all looking like? I was basically reliving all of the stuff that my dad went through. My dad died 2 years ago, and I was in that vicious circle, and his father was in that vicious circle. So when I got that opportunity to stand back and look at it, okay, I can change it. And as I said at the start, I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to advocate that anybody stops taking their medication or that your own medical support is not good already. This is very much my story, and most importantly, to share an understanding of how I got to the point of connecting to the neuroscience of the mind, body, and vagus nerve. But in terms of, I'm sure everybody who's here, the one thing that I can say, and that I see all the time with my own client work, is it's slow and steady. Little bits of change in your life can start to improve how you feel. I hope that's been helpful. It's not easy to kind of deliver it in a quick 25 minutes, but I hope it's given you guys some insight to my story and how I kind of manage things. The last thing I should say is I don't have IBS, I don't have asthma, I don't have any allergies, I don't have any chronic pain. I've got my sex drive back after 16 years of marriage. I don't think my wife is too keen about that, but hey. Generally speaking, right now as I speak, I've no anxiety, no depression. I haven't had any symptoms of anything physically or mentally since 2017, but I know it's a constant bit of work. Every day I get up, I show up for myself, I do the little bits that are needed, and I start again the next day, and that works quite well to regulate me and my body.